But we're very fortunate. Because first off, when we talk to historians that, I don't care what school they go to, black school, whatever, or Harvard or whatever, they do not give you our perspective. You know, when it is our perspective, it has to go through some kind of juicer or something before it become what we need to know it to be. This brother, as a graduate of that school, I think I'm proud. And I know everyone else here is proud. So, he's come all the way from West Virginia. Okay. I'm being commanded again. He's come all the way from West Virginia. And those of us that are here, we're going to get the opportunity to hear this brother firsthand again. Let us all welcome Brother Jose Pimienta here at National Church. Okay, give me here. Okay.
First of all, I see the hotel. As Brother James had explained, I come from West Virginia, from a location that I often refer to as being behind God's back. But fortunately, with the blessings of the Creator and the assistance of the ancestors, I was able to make it here this afternoon. Unfortunately, as the brother pointed out, I also have a very busy schedule and I'll be back to Philadelphia by 9 for another meeting. You have to excuse me too if I look a little tired. I am. But hopefully my vital force, my life force will sustain me at least long enough to finish what I came here to do, which is to share some very important information, I think, with you about one branch of the African family known as the Moors. What I did prior to my research for my PhD was I looked at the legacy of the Moors in the development of Western academic institutions. So when the golden age of the Moor ended the Bible, then certainly you see evidence of that legacy. The fact that the Moors played a vital role in helping to transmit both ancient knowledge, the ancient knowledge of Kemet, as well as whatever contributions were being made by the Greeks. Notice I said whatever contributions. I'm an honest man, so I don't argue that no Greek had an intelligent thought. But the reality is that we know that the foundations of that knowledge are in the Nile Valley. What I did, however, for my dissertation research was I started to look more at the significance of the Moors here in the Americas. Now, what was intriguing was that, of course, many people have dealt with the topic. There's a fellow here, brother here today, who you may know, Prince Cuba, I should say. I should know better because my father is from Cuba. So, Prince Cuba. And he's done some work as well. And Peter Lamborn Wilson, who is an Irishman, has done on the Moorish legacy. But I didn't want to do a history of the Moorish Science Temple because I didn't have time. That would be, and it is a very difficult task. But what I didn't want to do was to look at the historical significance of what the Moorish Science Temple movement was saying when it was established, first here, in fact, in Newark, New Jersey in 1913. So I looked at 5 historic assertions. These historic assertions were assertions that some people would consider to be mythical, because mythical implies that there's no historical validation for the assertion. Now, I don't believe it's mythical, and after doing the research, I know it isn't mythical. But again, when you're in the academic world, you have to prove your position. So you start with myth, and then you build and establish the fact that this myth is actually history. But the 5 quote-unquote mythic assertions that the Moorish Science Temple, as established by Noble Drew Ali in 1913 in Newark, New Jersey, actually becomes the Moorish Science Temple of America. It was the Holy Temple of Science first, were the following. 1, that the Moors were and are an African people with ancient historic links to both Africa and Asia. 2, that there was a pre-Columbian Moorish or African presence in the Americas. 3, that African Americans, i.e. blacks and so-called Negroes, are descendant of Moors. 4, that the Moorish Science Temple interpretations of Islam are historically precedented and even theologically appropriate. 5, that African Americans must officially declare their nationality as Moorish in order to attain the equal rights of all full U.S. citizens and avoid what is often constitutionally inconsistent and malicious treatment. Those are 5 mythic assertions. Those are 5 things that the Moorish Science Temple has been saying since its inception in 1913. What I wanted to do as a historian, using an Afrocentric worldview or paradigm, was to analyze each of those 5 contentions and to see whether or not it had historic validation. Most of the treatments that would deal with the Moorish Science Temple, people like Frank T. Simpson, when he was writing back in the 40s, writing for a Christian seminary, contended that the Moorish Science Temple's position was, again, historically inaccurate. Negroes in the Americas were not Moors. The so-called Moorish science interpretation of Islam was inappropriate. Then other people like C. Eric Lincoln, his text on black Muslims in America, made the same assertion that the Moorish Science Temple was making assertions that could not be defended, and that was that so-called Negroes and so-called colored people and so-called black people were actually Moors. In the process of going over this, meaning going over the existing historical record, a number of things are revealed that deserve some analysis. And so that I don't miss anything, I'm going to try to stick, as they say, to my script so that I can give you as much information as possible. One of the criticisms that Frank T. Simpson, in his piece on the Moors, that was in something called The Muslim World, which was actually written by Christians, and first and foremost European American Christians, was that nomenclature, the idea of taking the name Moor, a Moorish American, as a self-reference, was unimportant. He said the Negroes didn't need a new name for themselves. But if you look at this on an esoteric level, in keeping with the traditions of Nomo in the Nile Valley, if you look at this from a traditional African standpoint, we know how important names and words are. Names and words have power. So if you use certain names or words that you know are pejorative, it stands to reason that you may actually be altering the character of that thing which you have given the name to. The example I use is, I said in essence, how would Mr. Simpson feel if European Americans were all of a sudden to be primarily referred to as mutants or Geistmen? It's understandable that if that became a predominant term, it would begin to affect the position of European Americans or so-called whites in this society. Simpson also argued that the foundations of the Moorish Quran were from Levi Dowling's Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ. Howard University Divinity School put out something called the Directory of African American Religious Bodies. And they also said that this source was probably from Levi Dowling's work, which was published, I think, in 1906. But Peter Lamborn Wilson, in looking at the foundations of the same information, actually traced the information further back to a work by a Russian Jew who had gotten hold of a translation of what he believes was a Tibetan text that somehow made its way into the Western world. But the assertions in the Aquarian Gospel of Christ was seen to have had a foundation even earlier than in Levi Dowling's Aquarian Gospel. Also, if we're going to look at a theological issue, we should begin to evaluate things theologically. So what that means is, although both Simpson and the Directory of African American Religious Bodies represent theocentric, theological Christian organizations, they never suggest a spiritual or theological answer for the existing parallels between the Moorish Quran and the Aquarian Gospels. Yet from a theological standpoint, one could and perhaps should argue that spiritual truths can be found in many places. A truly theocentric theologian could easily argue that both Drew Ali and Levi Dowling had drawn from the same divine source or message and conveyed that same truth. Indeed, if the God force is everywhere, then one should find examples of it everywhere. Properly speaking, no one religion could theologically perceive itself as having a monopoly on spiritual understanding. In other words, if I see parallels between certain theological points in different religions, that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody took the other book and sat down and plagiarized it. If we believe that there is one universal force or law that governs all humanity, and there's one essential, or I say certain basic principles that are to be followed, whether you're looking at Ma'at or any other spiritual system as opposed to a religious system, which bogs one down in dogma, it stands to reason that you should see some parallels, because people say truth is that which is constant, it doesn't change. So that which was here 10,000 years ago among certain peoples that was able to sustain a harmonious environment, you should find it 10,000 years later. You should find bits and pieces of it all over the place. But again, even though these people call themselves theologians, that's not even considered. And then I already mentioned C. Eric Lincoln's assertion that the Moorish Science Temple didn't concern itself with historical accuracy, meaning what was this man doing arguing that Negroes and black people had anything to do with the Moors? Everyone knows that the Moors were Arabs. That was the perception, anyway, that people like C. Eric Lincoln and I guess Frank T. Simpson and several others had. So one of the things I did that I won't do now because of time, and I've gone through this before, and I think most of us here are probably familiar with it. We know that when we're talking about the Moors, we're talking about a predominantly African people. Is that to say that the Moors did not, over the course of centuries, intermarry with peoples from Persia and intermarry with peoples from the Arabian Peninsula? No, obviously they did do that. But when people look at the historic record and see references to Moors, it was understood even by Europeans that they were talking about Africans. What is interesting, however, is that in doing my study, I started to see that Europeans or Western academics were consistently making or drawing parallels between the Moors and certain other groups, and this seemed to cause some confusion, so I started looking at that more closely. Moors were linked to the ancient Moabites, so when you saw references to Moors, people argued that there was a connection between the Moabites and the Moors. Of course, that's one of the contentions of the Moorish Science Temple as well. They were also linked to the Canaanites. They were also linked to the Ethiopians. They were also linked to the Egyptians, also known as the Hamites or the Kemites, the Cushites, the Chaldeans, the Berbers, even Indians, as well as ancient Hebrew or Judaic peoples. We found that even among Western scholars, evidence existed which showed that all such ancient peoples, however, were understood to have been Africoid, if you will, in phenotype. What sometimes throws us off is we think that if we're dealing with Mesopotamia, we're not dealing with so-called black people or Africoid people. So consequently, if you look at references to people coming from Chaldea, the assumption is that the people weren't in Africa, so they couldn't be Africans. By that logic, no one in this room has anything to do with Africa because we're not standing in Africa right now. We understand that people migrated and moved to other areas. The West's recognition of such facts, okay, Western academia once asserted this openly. We know that these people are all interconnected, and I'll continue, and we'll see how that is quite clear. But the recognition of such facts only begins to change when Africa's political, economic, and military abilities decline, and inversely, Europe's ascends. That's when this starts to become, as they say on the people say on the street, it goes on the QT. It becomes very quiet in terms of discussing this. With regard to the etymology of the word Moor, this is what's also very interesting. Several people, of course, link the term Moor to the Greek Mauros, M-A-U-R-O-S, including, I forgot the brother's name, that just jumped right out of my head. Oh, it'll come back to me. But the brother who wrote the article on Moorish Spain, the light of Europe's dark age. No, I can't. This is a brother. Stanley William Poole was an English scholar. His name will come to me later. But the word Moor, according to the etymologist and linguist for the American Heritage Dictionary in 1978, said that the word Moor was probably of North African origin. Gerald Massey, who was known also as an English scholar, writing again at the end of the 19th century, did a lot of work with Egypt, light of the world, for example. Also contended that the word Moor was African in origin. In speaking to a friend of mine who was from Morocco, she told me something very interesting. She's from Fez. Her name is Fatima Alawi. She said that the word, one of the dialectic terms in Maghreb Arabic for Morocco was Moor accent. So there again you hear that phonetic sound of Moor, even in that name. But the people would generally just call the area Maghreb. The fact that Moorish Science Temple history makes specific references to the Moors being descendant of Canaanites and Moabites may appear to suggest a rejection of African ancestry. But the historical and theological record proves that such peoples, as I said, were primarily Africoid in phenotype. The fact that Moorish Science Temple history begins African history with the arrival of Moabite and Canaanite peoples into Africa may appear to indicate an emphasis upon a particular spiritual message. Okay? In other words, in Moorish Science Temple literature, there's a reference to people coming out of the land of Canaan, getting permission from the pharaohs to then move into other parts of what we now know as the African continent. What that seems to imply is that the peoples of Canaan, again, were not an Africoid people. Because people say, we're saying people coming in from Canaan, they're not coming in from Africa. That appears problematic if we consider that according to archaeology and even according to Greek mythology, both of which are controlled by Westerners. Life is said to begin in the southeastern part of what we now know as the African continent. Consequently, why would the Moorish Science Temple say that people left from Canaan and then moved after having gotten permission from the pharaohs of Egypt into other portions of the African continent? It appears problematic unless you're talking about people focusing on that group, not because they are the beginnings of the people who populate the African continent, but because of the spiritual message. In other words, people tend to begin their history with significant figures. If we have a family so if we have families and we start talking about relatives, we're not going to keep bringing up the uncle of ours who has an alcohol problem. We're going to talk about those things. We're talking about, your grandmother or your grandfather was one of the best teachers in Cheswell County in Delaware back in the late 19th century. And you kind of leave out the other portions because you're trying to give a historic lesson. You're being instructive. You're saying, focus on these things because this is what will make you feel more comfortable with self and get a better understanding of self. The peoples of Canaan, later Judeans and Israelites, practiced, in fact, an old Kemetic theology which rejected the idea that God could be symbolized by any singular earthly manifestation. I'll repeat that. The peoples of Canaan, later Judeans and Israelites, practiced an old Kemetic theology which rejected the idea that God could be symbolized by any singular earthly manifestation. That is to say that this group of people went back to an old Kemetic concept that God could not be circumvented. You couldn't say that this thing represented God. You could say this thing was an attribute of God, this was an element of God, but you couldn't say this is God. People like Strabo, who was a geographer, Greek geographer writing during the time, talks about these folks. He says that the Jews, the people who were allegedly responsible for introducing monotheism, were actually a group of Kemetic peoples who followed this old Kemetic theology about monotheism. In other words, monotheism had already existed in ancient Kemet, but people had fallen away from that understanding for various reasons. That's a whole other discussion that I'm not prepared to get into. But priesthoods were competing for power. So each one had an attribute and said, now if you want to get with it, you got to go this way. Other one said, no, if you want to get with it, you got to go this way. And each one was wrestling with the other. It was a business. But one group said, no, you put the idols down and focus on the one God, the one consciousness, or whatever, and don't lose track of your inability to circumvent God. Strabo talks about this, and he even tells us that Moses, in Book 16 of Geography, the Geography of Strabo, Moses and his connection to the Kemetic priesthood, which taught this concept of the divine being, Strabo said he agreed with Moses' teachings, stating, and I quote, people should leave off all image carving and should worship God without an image. Again, this is kind of ironic. Here's a Greek. Here's a Greek saying he agrees with Moses' concept of monotheism, which he also recognized as an old Kemetic theology, which is also linked then to Islam and also linked to the Moors by virtue of their being linked through various Western historical treatments to the Jews, to the Ethiopians, the Cushites, to the Chaldeans, all those peoples who are all occupying that same portion of the world. You're talking about East Africa and the region of Mesopotamia. In fact, several other histories, including that of the Roman Tacitus, makes the same assertion. Makes the same assertion. And I have to also add this. Many people, including the English historian, was a linguist and classicist, familiar with Martin Bernal and Black Athena, Martin Brunel has pointed out the linguistic connections between Canaanite language and Hebrew, and that the people are understood to have a definite connection. So if the Moorish Science Temple, the Moorish movement, was talking about connections with the Canaanites, they weren't negating any connection to Africoid people. Plus, they were also pointing out this connection to these original Judaic peoples who were understood to have been Africans. Like I said, it's a little complex. And Western academics have done a masterful job at trying to leave a trail of confusion. But people say if you read close, you can make sense of it. Okay. Some other things. Interdisciplinary evidence. What I did in looking at these 5 points was I had to approach this not simply as a historian, but I had to make use of other disciplines. I looked at linguistic studies and what linguists had to say. I looked at archaeologists and what archaeologists had to say. I looked at art history. I looked at anthropology, what anthropological studies had to say. And as a consequence, it became clear, again, that we were talking about the Moors as African people, even though, and you probably all know the answer to this, if you go now and talk about the indigenous peoples of Morocco or the Maghreb, the term that people use is Berber. So the people are Berbers. Nobody uses Moor anymore. Truth of the matter is, Berber is a foreign term that has no base. If you went to Morocco and spoke to the peoples, the indigenous peoples, no one's going to answer the Berber. They have names, ethnic names for themselves. They call themselves Zanata, they call themselves Sanheja, they call themselves Kashal, they call themselves by ethnic names that indicate who they are. But what's happened is that European academics have taken the term Berber, stuck it into Africa, and then given a whole new definition for what it is. I brought slides, but I didn't get a chance to mention that I was going to use I needed some slide projector. Yeah, because I want to show you some slides. But actually, you know already, if you've seen my article, what I'm talking about. Both those sisters in that book, if anyone has the Golden Age of the Moor, both sisters in the book are referred to as Berbers. But yet, the Western world tends to focus on the one who was lighter in complexion as being a proper representative of the Berber peoples. Why? In order to negate the idea that people of darker complexions made any contributions through the Moorish civilization coming into Spain and to Portugal. So we should understand that Berber as a foreign word has no significance. Some other significant things that came up that I started to look at. Portuguese accounts, Portuguese explorers of Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries referred specifically to Moorish cities being at the following places: Sofala, Angola, Zambezi, Mafia, Kilwa, Mombasa, Mogadishu, Malindi, and Pemba. Again, what that tells us is that the Portuguese knew that Moors were not simply the people living in the northwestern corner of the African continent. In their estimation, a Moor were people who were all over the African continent. Other things reveal that when Portuguese accounts talk about some of the Moors being fair, some of the Moors being darker, some being brown, some of the Moors speaking Arabic, and some of the Moors speaking the language of the country. Again, clearly indicating that you're talking about the Moors as being African people and being in areas far greater than just what we know now as Morocco. Another misconception that comes up in the works of people like Eric Lincoln, even Essam Uldam in Black Nationalism, is that the Moorish Science Temple contends that Moors come originally from Morocco. Everybody came from that little portion of the world, the country known as Morocco, and that's not true. The Moorish Empire extended at one time as far south as the Senegal River and as far east as the border of Egypt. Different European scholars, different European travelers knew that. They knew that, and they talked about that. This will have particular significance too when we start looking at the issue, one of the issues that I raised, of what's the significance or importance, or why would the Moorish Temple and Drew Ali maintain the so-called mythic assertion that one had to officially declare a nationality. So that'll have significance later. A good way to explain, okay, the application and significance of the use of the word Moor in the mind of both Europeans and even Africans who were going beyond the boundaries of Africa, Moorish boundaries in Africa to other places, is to compare it with the term British. Because this is something that confuses, I think, people at times to say, well, the Moor is only referring to Morocco, which I've already pointed out is not true. Historically, what is it represented? Well, again, using the analogy of British. British is understood to be a general reference for all those persons who are subjects and residents of Great Britain. What does Great Britain constitute? The United Kingdom. What are the countries? Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England. Right? So someone say they're British. You can say, well, you're British, but what country are you from? Well, I'm from Scotland. I'm Scottish. You can be Scottish and British at the same time. Legally speaking, in terms of if you're a British subject, what did that mean? Okay? Such persons who are British subjects would maintain their rights as British subjects as long as they continue to accept and abide by the laws of the British government. They acknowledged that they would concede themselves to British authority. They said, British authority is in London, so that's the center of the seat of the government. We concede. Simultaneously, or similarly, one could, for example, be Moorish and Wolof at the same time. One could be Moorish and be Tukulor at the same time, historically speaking. But we have to understand we're talking about people leaving the African continent and engaging Europeans outside of the country to then use the term Moorish. Because historically Europeans understood what Moorish meant. But there was something else too, but I'm going to get into shortly when I talk about the significance of treaties. Central political authority within the old Moorish Empire, however, was often challenged. Because of these internecine and political struggles, the empire eventually deteriorated and fragmented. Even in the present country or kingdom of Morocco, the national or ethnic designate of Moor has only become relevant to a relatively small pocket of people. In Morocco today now, if you go to Fez, people say, well, that's where all the Moors are. If you go to Fez, people walk around in Fez who will still answer to Moor. They don't answer to Arab. They reject the term Arab. They call themselves Moors. Now the larger country, because of the influence of Orthodox Islam and of course the rise of Arab hegemony and the interest of economics and oil and all that, people will say, I'm Arab. If it means I'm going to benefit from the system, I'm an Arab. So people, again, being opportunists and responding to that. But you still have people, a small pocket, walking around saying, I'm Arab, I'm a Moor. But they don't talk about them as much. And in fact, you can get yourself into some degree of trouble if you go there talking about you all the Moors and not Arabs. In addition, the name of a former Moorish province, Morocco, has now become the name of a country. Morocco was once basically a city-state. Now it's the name of a country. Okay. And that has caused confusion among several people. Some other things that came up as a consequence of looking at these 5 mythic assertions in terms of looking at what the Moorish Temple was saying is that many histories, either intentionally or unintentionally, kept drawing parallels and making connections to the Nile Valley, to Kemet. You have, like the Moorish Empire in ancient Kemet, a similar history of conflict between 2 regions, north and south. You have the Moors also being racially obfuscated by Eurocentric scholars who thought it necessary to de-Africanize the Moors via semantics and reclassification. As with Kemet, the Moorish impact upon the civilizing and technological advancement of Europe was and is simply too profound to be African. You can't leave the Moors as African any more than you can leave the Kemites as African, because the Western world understands that they have so much of their own culture, which is based in the Nile Valley. They can't let it go. They can't let it go, at least not publicly. Linguistics and historical data suggest some profound connections between the ancient Kemites and the Moors. You're familiar with Cheikh Anta Diop, who was a Senegalese scholar, a chematologist, if you will, although he studied Egyptology, but he certainly was not interpreting things as an Egyptologist. Also happened to be a Murid, or a Marabout, one of the brotherhoods, the Muslim brotherhoods in Senegal, which will come up shortly too. He talked about the linguistic connections between Kemet and other parts of the African continent. Well, in going over some 18th century, 19th century sources that an English traveler by the name of James Gray Jackson, he talks about the presence of the word ma'at among the Moors. The Moors used the word ma'at. It's part of the dialect. It meant terminated body. They used the word ka, which meant brother. They used the word ba, which meant mother. And these things do not appear coincidental in the face of a lot of other evidence. E.W. Boville, who wrote the book The Golden Trade of the Moors, informed us of the 1,600-year-old Egyptian-like tomb. These are his words. An Egyptian-like tomb, which was found in Tafilelt in southern Morocco. A Moroccan scholar, who is also a friend of mine, named Aziz Lotfi, who is a linguist, found Cushitic family names among many Moorish or so-called Berber Moroccans. He pointed out, he said, particularly among the Haratins of southern Morocco. There's also the existence of pyramids in Lixus, Morocco, that Ivan Ben Sertima pointed out some years ago. And then lastly, there are even official English Masonic histories which say that there's a connection between the Nile Valley and the Moorish Empire. They talk about the connection between the Moors via Fut. All these things illustrate close historical and cultural ties existing between the Nile Valley and the Moorish Empire. James Jackson even reported that Egypt's Nile Valley flowed directly into Timbuktu, which was, if you will, a Moorish imperial city in the kingdom of Mali. Again, one of the things that can be confusing. People think that that Moor stops at Morocco because they're still thinking of present-day boundaries. Someone from Mali was also Moorish. They were Moorish and Malian, or Moorish and Mandinka. They would say what the ethnic group was. But indeed, if they left and went to a Western country, they would be identified as Moors, and they would present themselves as Moors, for people to understand, as well as saying Mali or Meli. George James, in Stolen Legacy, also alluded to the Moors' historical connectedness to the Kemites, when he told us in the classic work that the Moors were the custodians, quote unquote, of Kemetic culture. These are the folk, he said, who took it when the Romans had attacked and moved with the people say with the goods across the Maghreb and into the northwestern and the southwestern and the central western part of the African continent. Even the Moors' advanced scientific and cultural developments in the presence of relative backwardness is reminiscent of ancient Kemet and her neighbors. It is also significant that even the mystical Moorish marabouts, okay, the marabout tradition in the western part, in the northwestern part of Africa, is one that is perceived as being very mystical. People said to have the power to levitate objects and telepathy and everything else. And you can read accounts by anthropologists, European anthropologists, talking about these marabouts moving objects with their minds. French anthropologists saying they witnessed these things. Lucy Bierman, in a book that she wrote on the Senegal brotherhoods, Marabout brotherhoods in Senegal, talks about this. And that's what people say are respectable texts, Harvard University Press. And it's not a fiction work, it's an anthropology work. Those type of things also indicate a connection to the Nile Valley. Because again, the Nile Valley priests are said to have had the ability to do all those same things. So again, what we're talking about is this continuum of culture, this continuum of understanding, this continuum of science. By way of Moorish Andalus, Africans and Asians brought their scientific and theological knowledge into Europe and made it accessible to all who were interested. You know from your readings about the schools at Granada and Cordoba. You know from the readings of the Golden Age of the Moor about the schools in Bologna in Italy, in Naples, and Spain again, in Salamanca, and even as far as Oxford University in Britain. And how Moorish texts were finding their way into these places and being translated. So Europeans definitely took advantage of these works for the sake of improving upon their own societies. And you remember Alphonse X, who dedicates his life to translating these works and making them accessible. Okay. The main thing I wanted to point out when going over those things is, again, clearly indicating the Africanity of the Moors and also pointing out this continuum, this cultural continuum, and lastly, preparing you for my discussion later about the significance of nationality and why it's seen as being so important in the Moorish movement. Why do you have to officially declare anything? Okay. One of the other chapters that I dealt with, and I'll just go over this one quickly. One of the other chapters in my work, I dealt with the issue of Moors or the African presence in pre-Columbian America. Okay, what was the legacy of the Moors in places like Panama, and Colombia, and Ecuador, and Peru, and Brazil, for example? What evidence existed? And what we find is that several heads, several artifacts can be found dating from 2000 BCE in those areas, which are described by art historians, including Alexander von Wuthenau, who wrote the text Unexpected Faces in Ancient America, if anyone familiar with that work, goes into details about these Moorish-looking heads, and goes into details about how certain figurines resemble those of the Sephardim, which are basically, if you will, African and Iberian Jews, as opposed to Ashkenazim, who are European Jews who know that they're not phenotypically representative of the original Judaic peoples. Von Wuthenau also believes that there is, of course, a cover-up among many anthropologists and art historians of Mesoamerica to hide this information. The question one might ask again is why? Why? What's the purpose of hiding this information? Well, I think you know the answer to that. What else do we find? We find Moorish names. We find Moorish names present among Native American peoples. Names like Atlantis, or Atlantis, Bucoyas, Gomares, Paraises, Marabillos, which is also linguistically related to Marabut, or Moabite, or Marabitine, which is also another name, a Brazilian Moorish name found among Native Americans. French scholar from the 19th century named Bourbourg, Brasseur de Bourbourg, said that several princes in the country of Panama had names which he referred to as being completely Moorish or biblical. That was his assessment in the 19th century. Two such names being Dobaida and the other being Aben Amechi. Dobaida and Aben Amechi. R.V. Ramos, who wrote an article in Van Sertima's edited work, Early African Presence in Early America, wrote an article on Carib history recounting the Carib Indians. Carib history recounting how Columbus thought that these woolly-haired, and he described as woolly-haired, these woolly-haired Indians were Mohammedans. That's what he called them. So these woolly-haired Indians were Mohammedans. According to Ramos, Columbus even thought that their language was some form of Arabic. Now here's a man who's a Venetian, who spent a great deal of time in Spain and in Portugal. He would certainly know what a dialect of Arabic sounds like, because he was there during the time just before and right after the decline of Moorish power in Granada, the last stronghold, when it went down. It's no accident that 1492 signals the decline, which signals the decline of Moorish power and the fall of Granada, also signals the exploration of the Spanish and the Portuguese to the New World. And they made, took a great deal of advantage, I should say, of the navigational works, the cartographical works, the know-how, the historical information that the Moors had given them access to. And indeed, there were even Moors who were part of the fleet that went over during exploration. That's no accident. Kofi Wangara found that the Carib people possessed Califurnum. And this is something which if anyone has any, after I finish, if you have any information or positions on this, I'd be curious about it. California and Califurnum. I'm still trying to figure out if there's a connection. But the word Califurnum, or Black Guanini, was a name that was found among the Mandinka who spoke Arabic. I also consider it very significant that Columbus's translators, who were fluent in Arabic, Chaldean, and Hebrew, were able to converse almost immediately with the king of Cuba, as they called him. Now, in Columbus's own diaries, he says that he had on board these two translators. He said between the two of them, they spoke Chaldean, Arabic, and Hebrew. If you thought you were going to India, you should bring someone who speaks Hindi. You don't bring someone who speaks Arabic and speaks Hebrew and Chaldean, which was understood to be associated with the Moors as well. So what's going on? There's a discussion of whether Columbus was lost. I don't think Columbus was lost at all. He knew exactly where he was going. He had some help. French professor of anthropology, early 20th century, late 19th century, name of Alphonse de Quatrefages, argued that the Jamasi of Florida, these are Native American peoples, and the Caribes of the Caribbean were phenotypically, and I quote him again, true Negroes who'd settled in the pre-Columbian Americas and intermarried with the peoples they met. Van Sertima says that Muslim blacks called Almamis were known to have occupied areas of Honduras prior to Spanish arrival. Van Sertima also points out that American maize actually reached southern Africa before the Dutch or Portuguese traders arrived in the 15th century. The significance of this is now we're compelled to question this issue of the Indian or Native American identity. We tend to think that when someone says someone was an Indian, or when you read accounts, they met the Indians at the shore, 15th century, 16th century, we imagine someone who looks like Chief Joseph, typically. Has to have straight black hair, a reddish-brown complexion, and an aquiline nose. The reality is that many of these people who were Indians, referred to as Indians, you would look at now, and even Europeans would look at as they look like black folks to me. But yet there's this confusion about this that is with us that, again, has significance, and we'll see as I continue. Significantly, Robert Beverly II, who was considered one of the fathers of Virginia history. Robert Beverly II is considered to be one of the first professional historians in the Virginia colony. He likened the foods of the Virginia Indians to the foods of the Moors of Fez and the Ethiopians. Very interesting for him to do that. Here's a man who's traveled. Here's a man who obviously knows something about the foods of Fez and the foods of the Ethiopians. And he's drawing this connection between the Virginia Indians. Something else is very revealing. And again, all this speaks to then this issue of a pre-Columbian and a significant Moorish presence in the Americas. The Reverend Eliza Wheelock. If you've ever heard of Wheelock's Moors Indian Charity School. Anyone ever heard of that? The Moors Indian Charity School was set up in Connecticut, 1766, by Reverend Eliza Wheelock. Now, when you go back and look at the primary sources and books were written, the primary source that I saw was written, actually that's a number. One was his memoirs, which would be published almost like periodicals. Like every year he published an update because he was trying to get funds for this group. But check this out. The Moors Indian Charity School was set up in Connecticut, in New Lebanon, Connecticut, for the purpose of teaching Indians how to be good Christians, how to become amalgamated, or assimilated, I should say, into the English society. Now, the name Moors Indian Charity School is allegedly because Moor was the name of the first person who gave money to set up the school. Two primary donors, a man named Moor, who they don't give any more information about, okay? They just say a guy named Moor, who was a wealthy landowner in Massachusetts, donated money to the school, and that's why they call it Moors Indian Charity School. But then after that, there's no other reference anywhere in this 225-page book to who this man was. You name something after someone, you should give a little biography of who this person is. The other donor was someone named Redman. We need to understand, I've been through this before. Names are very revealing, particularly when you understand that certain eras, certain periods, people would use certain names to indicate what your nationality was, what your status was. People know you've heard the name Schwarzenegger. Schwarzenegger, the swarthy man of Africa, or the swarthy plowman. Neger either means plowman, someone who works the land, or it means an African. So it either means a so-called black man, or it means a black plowman, or African plowman. What does that tell us about the history of Austria? Names like Morris and Morrison and Stewart and Halliburton and Andrews and Bleem and Maniot and Zamoras. All those names. But also, the name Moor, when you see it as a last name without an E, was more often than not a descriptive of the person. See, now when people say Dudley Moore, he's got an E on the end of the name. It's understood that he may descend from some Moors, but now he's a good Englishman. But people would use the term Moor as a last name to indicate your nationality. That's what you were. So when we see this reference to Moors Indian Charity School, that's very significant. Now, what does Reverend Wheelock say? That is also helpful. Reverend Wheelock also refers to Jesus as our prophet. Say what? This man's a Christian minister and he's calling Jesus our prophet. Something is not kosher, so to speak. Something's not right. To lead this group, to lead this Indian Charity School, and to bring Native Americans into the group who were part of the Iroquois League, okay, of the New York area, the Iroquois League. People like the Onondaga and the Seneca, okay? And again, Seneca, the Seneca Indians of New York State, the word also, Seneca, is traced semantically, linguistically, to Azenaga, or Senegal, which is the name of the African country, the name of a Berber ethnic group. So something is going on here when you start looking at these things. And again, people say, where there's smoke, there's fire. To get the rest of it, people say to find the proverbial smoking, quote-unquote, smoking gun, it's helpful, but there's so much already that's telling us pretty clearly that we're dealing with Moors. Wheelock specifically called the American Indians Asiatics, and he then said that the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Choctaw were related to the Arabic peoples, and the Persians, and the Kurds. Now, what did he know, writing in 1768? In popular American folk history, or people say folk or people's history, people often said that the Native Americans and the Africans were the same people. You can find any number of historical writings arguing that the Africans and Native Americans were related. They were all descendants of Ham. They were all Canaanites. They were connected to the Jewish people. You even have William Penn saying when he arrived in Pennsylvania, or what becomes Pennsylvania, when he arrived in somebody else's country, later it becomes Pennsylvania, you have him saying the people reminded him of the Jewish quarter in London. That's rather revealing. And then you have von Wolfenau, who says specifically that the Jewish quarter in London was largely Sephardim. European explorers like the 16th century's Hernán de López Castaneda produced a text showing that the Portuguese labeled Moorish Mozambique as the Indias. Mozambique was called the Indias by the Portuguese. And if you came from Mozambique, then you were an Indian. What else? Europeans as late as 1822 were writing books like The Negro, this is a title, The Negro, a sketch of the birth and education of an African Indian by Salop Wellington. It was a personal history about a young Gambian man. Written in 1822, the book contains illustrations of Gambian Africans dancing in the rainforest with the captions, "Indians dancing." What this does is it compels us to reassess what the significance is. Oh, okay. I may have to do that actually, running out of steam. But it compels us to reassess the meaning of the word Indian. And I'll get more into this now as we proceed. The term Indian was not always reserved for the singular phenotype of what I call the cigar store Indian. An 1824 court case involving a man by the name of Amos Daly in South Carolina pointed out that genuine, these are the words that the court used, genuine Narragansett Indians were known to have woolly hair and brown complexions. The Narragansett Indians live up in Massachusetts and around Maine. And I already talked about the Carib Indians with woolly hair. Wesley Jones, who was a Mormon, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, dealing with a critical study of Mormon sources, had actually pointed out that many of the Mormon assertions about the Indians argue that they were related also to African people. There was a connection, and he points out that that was also considered part of popular history, or folk history. Those of you who are familiar with or who knows, if you're familiar with or know Charles C. Lawrence McIntyre, who was part Mi'kmaq, Indian people, again coming down, I should say, from the area of Maine and Massachusetts. And she maintains, too, the same thing. There's a misperception about the Indian identity. People assume, when you're talking about Indians, that there's a singular phenotype. But what does that tell us? If I just pause for a moment, people say, and back up. Basically, what we're forced to do now is to reassess what an Indian is. If there's evidence showing that the phenotype of an Indian could also be Africoid, then we also see more information which justifies the idea of a Moorish presence. If the Moors are saying that there were Moorish or Africoid peoples already here in pre-Columbian America, and Europeans are saying when they hit the shores and go various places, they're coming into contact with Indians, and we automatically assume these Indians would have to look, like I said, like someone who was a representative of the typical dime store or cigar store Indian. We can see how confused we could get about this idea of identity. In fact, something very revealing. A Native American historian by the name of Jack Forbes, who wrote a book called Africans and Native Americans, points out that, in fact, when you talk about the first shot fired during the Revolution, American Revolution, somebody speak up. Right, Crispus Attucks, right? Crispus Attucks, who was the first casualty, who was actually a Natick Indian, but yet we think of him as a black man. Well, yeah, he was a black man in terms, but you need to understand what that means, what the definition of black means. Okay, and that's what I'm gonna be getting into in about 5 to 10 minutes. The aquiline-nosed, long-haired, cigar-style wooden Indian is a classic symbol of Americana and the American Indian. But the historic use of this icon has evidently contributed greatly to limiting the phenotypic image which one can legitimately use to represent an American Indian. You know, when a system of oppression does anything, it doesn't do anything typical, it does very little, just, you know, serendipity. It does things with a purpose. Why would people find the need to begin to reinforce the idea of a Native American looking a certain way? When in fact, as I already said, as late as 1822, people are writing books talking about Native Americans, talking about Indians, I should specifically say, and they're talking about African people. But that changes. What are people, you know, what were they trying to do? Consequently, there could be many American Indians walking around with socially imposed amnesia. Most of these amnesiacs, however, would respond to the designate of black. Okay, meaning people say, I don't know, you know, but I do know that I'm black. Because that's what I was told. That's what I've accepted. Historians, consequently, must revisit and reinterpret the significance of many historical references to the enslavement of said Indians. So-called good hair and sharp or aquiline features did not always typify the phenotypes of all Indians. Okay. The Marabut issue. The Marabut issue. I've gone over that a little bit, so I can kind of skim through this a little quicker. But the reality is, when you're looking at the concept of Islam, the spiritual concept of Islam, there has always been a legacy of people interpreting it differently. People can take the position, well, but that's not orthodox. But the person who made the determination for being orthodox may not have the right to tell you what is orthodox. In other words, are we doing something more in the interest of politics or in the interest of spiritual development? When somebody says, oh, you don't, you know, it's just, you know, Sunni Islam does it this way, you don't do it that way, so you're a bad Muslim. And we know full well that that's unjustified. But even better than that, when you look at the Marabuts, the Marabouts tradition in Morocco. You see people who've been saying for over 1,000 years, we can interpret Islam however we choose. The bottom line is there's one God we refer to as Allah, but with all due respect, Islam didn't begin with this Arab prophet named Muhammad. Peace be upon him, but it didn't begin with him. So we will rise to give honor to him and all the others. That's known. But in Morocco today, because of the Sunni emphasis politically, people find themselves in trouble when they make such assertions, and so they have to keep, people say, keep quiet. Okay? A point that is made by Suleiman and Yang, who was at Howard, historian, is that if you're looking at a very old African spiritual concept, it's one of harmony. The idea that I do things primarily in the interest of harmony. So I don't come to you with dogma, because then I've circumvented, I've dropped the wall around me. I'm not going to hear anything you say, because I said it's this way and it's only this way. As opposed to thinking, well, no, let me listen to what you have to say, and we'll find the common theme between the two of us, or all of us. And he points out that that's a major position. As actually, he's quoting Mbiti, John Mbiti, who's done a lot of work on African spirituality. Okay. The Marabouts of Africa have a tradition of provincial messengers and teachers. Very important, very significant. A tradition. It is nothing for someone to say, well, I'm Muslim, but I follow the order of this particular brotherhood. And our holy people are this brother right here, the Al-Tijani brotherhood, or whomever. So we recognize, I respect your concept of Islam as an Arab Muslim, but don't tell me that messengers and teachers don't come to individual communities, because I know better than that. And again, that was one of the arguments against the Moorish Temple, coming from people like Frank T. Simpson, C. Eric Lincoln, and a lot of Sunni-centered Muslims who took the position that what right did Ali have to come here and start teaching people his own brand of Islam? It wasn't his own brand of Islam. The essence is the same. The essence is the same. People are not concerned with dogma. They're concerned with the essence. They're concerned, do you follow with the basic tenets, love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice? You could call yourself a tree worshiper, but if I see you manifesting those 5 principles, you're a Muslim. But what happens when people say, oh no, you got to do it this way. You got to walk like this, and you got to do it exactly like me. Because if you don't, then you're a bad Muslim, and I got to push you out the way. That causes a major problem. It's caused problems for us for many years. Being dogmatic instead of spiritual. Being religious instead of spiritual. Marabout sheikhs. That's right. Marabout sheikhs or sheikhs or leaders have led various orders of Muslims. Shrines exist in Morocco and in other parts of the former Moorish Empire, which stand as monuments to men and women. To men and women who have served their communities and best represented divinity on earth. Something else is often left out of the mix. When I was in Morocco, and I'm in Marrakesh, and I see these big, beautiful marble tombs with round, round tops. And I asked, I said, what was that? And he said, that's one of the shrines or tombs of a holy woman. I said, the shrine, tomb of a holy woman? I said, really? This is years ago. This is before I started to become familiar with this. And I said, I said, it's funny, I never hear any Muslims in Sunni Islam, for the most part, that I've encountered, talking about holy women who they've erected shrines to. So I knew that there was something very unorthodox about it. There's something very unorthodox about Marabout Islam, Moorish Islam. William Spencer, who studied in Morocco for some 10 years as a European, told us that the Marabouts of Morocco, again to his definition, were saintly men and women who had acquired a circle of disciples who propagated their beliefs. He said that nearly every Moroccan town had a patron marabout, a marabout. Again, indicating that something was missing. Something's missing if there's not a feminine principle in Islam. Something's missing if you take the position that only men can be spiritual leaders. And Africans knew that. And that's why when Islam, Arab style, came in, they said, well, yeah, I understand bits and pieces, we're going to do it this way. Because the essence of what you're saying is true. But you added all this cultural baggage onto it that we can't appreciate. Because that's your reality coming out of the Arabian Peninsula. But it's not ours. Unfortunately, this is something which is not often presented. How many people know about it? Said brother knows. That's right. But I mean, we're talking about a minority of folks. People say, what happened? Llewellyn Hall, this is another concept. Llewellyn Hall, who is a historian, deals with diplomatic history of the U.S. and Morocco, defined baraka. And you've heard of Midi Baraka, of course, the famous playwright. But defined baraka, which is supernatural power thought to be in the descendants of Muhammad, holy men, holy women, and sacred words. So if someone has baraka, you have that supernatural power that links you to some significant spiritual teacher, man or woman. The Marabout concept of baraka and the emphasis upon provincial leaders and centers of power caused them to be viewed by the hegemonic Sunni as improper Muslims. The Marabouts are often considered a nuisance by the Islamic orthodoxy in Morocco and other places, and the governing officials who adhere to Sunni Islam. Moorish Temple Islam essentially represents the same concept. In Moorish Temple, women can be the spiritual leaders. There are grand governesses who are in charge of states. The sister who was from my state, from New York State, Sister Eloise Jefferson-Neal, peace be upon her. She passed away a couple of months ago, but she was a spiritual leader for the state of New York. If I back up a moment too and mention something else, Eliza Wheelock, who I talked about before, the Moor's Indian Charity School fellow, talks about the body of governesses. These are his words, these aren't mine. The body of governesses, he's writing in 1768, the body of governesses that voted to determine who would have power among the Iroquois. Okay. Like I said, I just wanted to go over a couple of those things, and I was going to jump ahead because I'm going to take about another 10 minutes. Okay. Now, I already mentioned before that in all this, there seems to be there's an interesting connection. I dealt with this because I've heard people say, the influences of Drew Ali were Masonic. He was a member of a Masonic order. He was a Shriner. And again, I didn't decide to look into the history of that because I wouldn't even know really where to begin in terms of getting sources to validate something like that. And I really wasn't concerned about that. My primary concern was, I said, if that was the case, what is it about Masonry that is similar to Islam? What is it about Masonry specifically that's similar to Marabout or Sufi Islam? The idea of having orders and lodges. Essentially, we should understand, if you look at, and this is what's so amazing, people talk about the secrecy of Masonry. Masonry is really not that secret. You can go to the library and get books written by Masons about Masonry. So it's not, people say, oh, it's a secret. Go to the library, pull out books written by Masons about their position, their belief system, right? Plenty of books. Plenty of books talking about what they believe. W.L. Wilmhurst, European Mason, in fact, he was also one of the Masonic officials, stated that Egypt was the great center of ancient learning, and its knowledge was the basis for men such as Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, Moses. Goes back to Strabo, what I talked about before. Moses, St. John, St. Paul. This guy's saying the foundations of the learning for all these people are in the Nile Valley, among the Kemites. All such great teachers of humanity studied Kemet's mysteries. Now, Masons concede in their official literature, this is from 1874, Constitution and General Statutes, and this is European Masonry, this isn't Prince Hall. This is the European sources. 1874, that most of the world's greatest knowledge is traceable to Kemet's ancient mysteries, and such literature specifically acknowledges the debt owed to the peoples of Kemet, Ethiopia, and India. The Masonically oriented Rosicrucians, anyone ever heard of the Rosicrucians, the Knights of the Rosy Cross, right? State that their founder, Christian Rosenkreutz, studied among Moorish Sufis in Fez. This is official literature. Official. This is what they're saying officially. This is not what people have made up. I'm not talking about it. This is what they say officially. Amazingly, when you start to break this down, you see that many of the most politically powerful, many of the most well-educated people within the Western world, of course, are Masons, who would have known this information at some point when they start to study deeper, and who know essentially full well that African people are connected to the Moors, are connected to the Kemites, are connected to the Judaic peoples. They know that, but the objective is not to tell you, because now you're empowered and you might turn the tables. Because your whole state of something else that comes up in esoteric and metaphysical learning, thoughts have power. Thoughts have power. Before there's action, there's a thought. If you really begin to pull out of you the essence of who you are, nothing can stop you from getting to where you need to go. But the battle generally with us is against ourselves. We're trying to convince ourselves of merit. We're trying to convince ourselves of our worth. What do Europeans do who are trying to oppress? They drop little things for us to pick up to try to slow us down. That Negro, that's yours. Oh, this is mine? Yeah, so we carry Negro on our back for a while, and we can't get very far. Or we carried colored on our back, and couldn't get very far. Or we carried black on our back, and we can't get too far with that either. On a metaphysical and on a philosophical level, we see the problem there. You have people say, I think it says in the Kabbalah, in fact I know it says in the Kabbalah, before you can defeat your enemy, you must make him black. But keep in mind, we're speaking English. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? We're speaking English. The word, what I say, words have power. You have Native Americans like the Nanakoke in Delaware. You had Native Americans like the Choctaw and like the Guinea Indians in West Virginia. In West Virginia, there's Guinea Indians, who refused to be called black, Negro, or colored. On one level, people said, well, it's because they didn't want to be associated with the terms, because the terms were legally limiting. A Negro person didn't have access to the same education. A colored person had a little more access, but we're talking about a caste system. I want to be known as an Indian because I know my rights are greater under the designation of Indian. That's one explanation. But the other explanation is that the Indian said, if you embrace something which is not yours, and which was known to be pejorative, you carry that negative energy, you carry that negative weight with you. If somebody called you an idiot, you know better than to accept that and run around calling yourself an idiot. The problem is that people have accepted a term and it becomes, it's expedient now to use the term. But have we thought about this from an Afrocentric position? As much as we look at Ma'at and Kemet and the foundations of the Nile Valley being so significant, what happens when we simply fail to recognize that we're African people? What happens when we fail to recognize that we're Asiatics? What happens when we fail to recognize that we're Moors? By grabbing up a term which was put on our backs to slow our progress, so to speak. I always maintain, I've never heard an Asian say that he was a yellow American. Not once. Well, we as yellow Americans need to get our act together. You know, so we're going to have the first annual meeting of the yellow Americans that you don't hear about. It doesn't happen. They understand that they're Asian, and they'll say, well, I'm Japanese or whatever. We know African, even if they don't know the rest. I've met Asians who say, well, I'm part Japanese, but then there's some German, and then there's some, you know, they run it down. But they're hitting nationalities. They're hitting things that have a foundation. Then it's, I'm part Native American, I'm part Japanese and part yellow, or I'm just yellow and part German or whatever. They don't do that. What does that mean on a metaphysical level? What does that mean on a metaphysical level? And we know so much of our traditions have told us that we need to pay more attention to the metaphysical. Okay. 5 more minutes. Because I know I just looked at my watch. Okay. In fact, what I'll do is I'm just going to kind of read through this. Drew Ali and the Moorish Temple have argued that the historical limitations and disenfranchisement means not allowing someone to vote, denying them political power. That the historical limitations and disenfranchisement of African peoples and others was directly related to the names which were applied to them. In his 1928 speech, Drew Ali said that those U.S. residents who denied the use of their free national name would endure whatever mistreatments the citizens care to bestow. Ali considered it a sin for any people to cling to names that related them to slavery. And again, that's what black, colored, and Negro represented. Those were names that were applied to people who were non-recognized nationals. Okay? The historical record definitely reveals that persons lacking recognized national names had limited rights. Richard B. Moore, in the book The Negro, the word Negro, the term Negro, it's evil use.
It's evil use.
And it's evil use, right. It's evil use. Pointed out that the word was saddled on African people who were enslaved. You capture someone, you take them from their environment, and now you call them a Negro. What happened to the Moors in Spain? You're defeated. From this point on, you're officially known as Moriscos and Mudejars, the broken ones, the tamed ones, the little Moors. Later it becomes Negros. Why? Why the need to change that? Why can't you just suppress them as Moors? Moro, you know, Veneca, period. Not Morisco, not Mudejar, not Negro. Why? What did people think? And let me add another dimension. Again, talking about the esoteric. Don't think for a moment that the Catholic Church didn't get into esoteric studies and looking at the metaphysical, groups like the Jesuits and groups like the Order of Christ. These people understood that they needed to understand something about the metaphysical. And very often we were their teachers. But they took it and used it against us out of our own ignorance. The Cuban scholar Fernando Ortiz said that in the Hispanic world, this is up to the 60s, in the Hispanic world, negro meant slave, period. You called someone a negro, you call him a slave. He pointed out that moreno was a term used to refer to an African person who was free. African person who you respected. You respected someone you call moreno. You didn't call him a negro. And there's that word Moor again, which keeps surfacing. For most Europeans of the medieval period through the early 19th century, Moor was a respectful designation for Africoid persons. Perhaps most significantly, Moor was also recognized by Europeans as a nationality. When the English made treaties with Morocco, they referred specifically to Moors. They said, we abide by the treaty and we'll look out for the interests of the Moors, they'll look out for our interests. When the U.S. made a treaty, in its treaty in 1786, it talks about Moors. Consequently, you find examples of people who are possessive of full rights, so-called full white rights, who were Moors in the 18th century. You find an example of a prince named Rahman, who was captured and brought to the United States and sold into slavery. And when it's found out that he's a Moorish national from Mali, he is freed, because the treaty was still in effect. Again, indicating there's something important about having the designate of Moor as a national name, having you recognized as being a Moor by the government in place. So that begins to make a heck of a lot of sense. What else do we find? We go through some others. Colonial Virginia laws of 1748 show Moors with special privileges. Specifically, a petition drawn up in 1790 by Moors living in South Carolina was intended to avoid the status of Negro. They said, we don't want to be seen as Negroes, we want to be Moors. And the House of Representatives in South Carolina said, you're right, you're Moors, you have the rights of citizens. Joseph Ben-in-Hali, who was one of the Moorish petitioners that went, and his descendants continue to enjoy freedom as so-called whites. And I have to say this, white is a reference, it's a caste. White is a caste, it's not a phenotype, historically speaking. We're talking about a caste system, like Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra. In fact, Jack Forbes, the Native American historian, says that America's history, dealing with white and black, and I'm using his words, is essentially a history of citizen and non-citizen. Jack Forbes says that the history of America with regard to white and black is a history of citizen versus non-citizen, because that was what the term was understood to mean. In South Carolina and Louisiana, James Pendarvis and Elias W. Garden were re-designated as white persons by a municipal justice because they said that they were subject and obedient to the law. They were subject and obedient to the law. Both men were known to be of African ancestry, but they're re-designated as white by the state government. I already pointed out how Native Americans knew the significance of nationality. Finally, Malafi Asante, in his work, Kemet, Afrocentricity and Knowledge, makes the following statement. Sepulveda and Oviedo, these two Spanish theoreticians, Sepulveda and Oviedo, theoreticians of the conquistadors, argued that the Indians did not have nationality and were by nature slaves. That was the excuse that the Spanish gave in the 15th and 16th centuries to enslave the Native Americans. You don't have a nationality, so you can be a slave. Charcy Lawrence McIntyre then points out in the 18th century something known as the Law of Nations, which people said, look, if I recognize your nationality, you're a freeman in this country. But if you don't have a free national name and you go on to the designation of a slave name, you're telling me you are not a free national. The process of disempowering and disenfranchising African people clearly related to the denial of their nationality. And I already pointed out, if I didn't, I'll point it out now. Seminole Indians, defeated in battle, redesignated as Negroes, and then sent into slavery. And then everything would be done to try to maintain that they continued this idea that they were Negroes. So you have them go to a school which is influenced by this idea, you're Negroes. So you continue to identify with slave status. Lynn Dumenil, who was a historian, European-American historian dealing with history of Masonry, talks about how European-American Masonry Masons are sticklers for the law. They're sticklers for the law. You have to do it in accordance with Masonic law. And to be accepted into Mason, you have to be what? Free, right? Free and accepted. How do you know if you're free? To be free, you have to have the status of a free person. What is the criteria for now? Slavery is over, right? Slavery's over. So at least de jure slavery we think is over, as opposed to de facto. But I mean, no one is compelling us now to work, as they say, for free at a gunpoint or the end of a cat o' nine tails or what have you. What is it then that requires one to be free? Why, for example, would Africans from Nigeria be allowed to join English Masonic groups? Why would Africans also be allowed to join, from Africa with a national name, be allowed to join European American Masonic groups? But American blacks, or blacks, aren't. Seems rather strange. Why would a Hawaiian, who is understandably not a Caucasian, be allowed to become a Mason in San Francisco in 1898? Very interesting. In Mexico, there were lodges which were allowing African Americans to go down and join Scottish Rite Masonic lodges in Mexico. And then when the Scottish Rite Order found out in the United States, they shut them down. The same lodges were also accepting women as Masons. Very interesting. What happened? That reference to women also being a part of that tradition also reminds us of the Marabout tradition of having people come into an understanding of people say spiritual law through the different orders, and then having meetings to discuss that and such. So again, it compels us to look at this issue of nationality more closely and the importance of a national name. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop there. There are a number of other things maybe I'll get a chance to go over later that I didn't get a chance to get into, and I think I may go for the 8 o'clock train because I know I'm not going to make the 7. But thank you, and if there are any questions, I'll take them now.
Drink some water.
Okay.
You ready? You can sit down. Go. Yeah, you're on.
Brother Bay, I really enjoyed your lecture, and this whole area of research, I say alhamdulillah, you brought it to the people here. Just a couple of questions I just have to ask you. Regarding the Noble Drew Ali, and you talked about the orthodoxy, some Muslims, some criticisms from some people. Was there any particular reason that you could, from your research, able to ascertain in terms of claiming Moor, which was nationality, but also a term that was generally used for Muslim in historical sense also, whether you're from Morocco or other places, even during the Crusades, they refer to them as the Moors. Why, from what you can gather, didn't Noble Drew Ali try to incorporate more of the so-called orthodoxy into the teachings? Because as a Moor, you're Muslim, and to some degree there was some Islamic principles, as you mentioned, that was inculcated. But in terms of the prayer, in terms of the fast, in Ramadan, in terms of the Hajj, those type of things. Any particular reason that you can gather why the research he stopped?
Okay. When you start to look at the history of Sufism and the Marabout tradition, you see that different orders will emphasize different things. And again, the problem that exists is most people, when they think of Islam, they're accustomed to thinking to Sunni Islam or the Orthodoxy. But when you start to look at the history of Islam in West Africa, at least certainly in Morocco and in Senegal, what you start to see is that people always challenged. There were always Africans who challenged that idea that Islam, or the concept of the tenets of Islam, began with the Arab world. So people looked, and I think it was Diop who pointed out that one of the reasons why Islam. I just lost his mic.
Go ahead. Keep going, sir. Keep going. Keep going, sir.
One of the reasons why Islam was able to take root in Africa is because so many aspects of African spirituality were similar to certain basic elements in Islam. But when the Muslims started saying, well, to be a good Muslim, you have to speak Arabic. And you have to make the Hajj to Mecca. And people were saying, well, we have shrines and holy places right here. The objective is to give honor to those messengers or spiritual teachers who exist in our own midst. For us to have to go outside of our community doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense in terms of that as an emphasis. Now, as to why, you said, well, why did Drew Ali decide not to follow orthodoxy? I would say it was because that his understanding of Islam was evidently more of the Marabut or Sufi tradition. Now, what I have not done and what I cannot answer is how that contact, and if there was, did Drew Ali have contact with someone who was a Marabut, who had shown him information or given him a perspective on Islam that was Marabut in focus? Or was his understanding of Islam actually in some way influenced by his growing up on a Cherokee reservation? Because strange as it may seem, when you start to look at the history of the Cherokee, you see some very interesting correlations to Islam. Sister who I mentioned before, Fatima Alawi, when she was in South Carolina, one of the reservations, she said that one of the elders approached her and they spoke, and after finished, he said, "Salam alaikum." And she said, "Oh, you speak Arabic?" He said, "Well, nice." He said, "That's Cherokee." That was his perspective as someone who was 67 years old. The other thing is when you start to look and find references to Cherokee leaders like Saladin Wati. Saladin Wati, who was a delegate, I think from the state of Georgia, who goes to Washington, D.C. in 1866. Again, this is indicating that there is some Islamic presence already there. Also, in Catalog, which is the Journal of South Carolina History, spring of 1993, there's an article by a fellow by the name of James Hagee, who talks about Omar ibn Said, who he says was thought to be practicing a syncretic form of Islam, because he had elements of Christianity, so he thought, and elements of Orthodox Islam, and he said they just kind of threw it together. But when you start to look at the history of Islam among the Moors, you see evidence that the Moors within Moorish boundaries were often interpreting Islam differently. James Gray Jackson said, 1805, when he was in Morocco, that some of the Moors said, "There is no God but God." Some of the Moors said, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet." He called the former deists. They didn't call themselves deists. They just said that, no, we don't emphasize any one prophet, because the emphasis is supposed to be on the one universal God. And there's another group that's saying that they need to focus on Muhammad. Okay? Peace be upon him. But if you're going to bring Muhammad up, bring all of them up. Peace be upon all the prophets. Peace be upon all those who sought to follow the basic principles of Islam, which are about harmony. But what happened is that people politicized Islam. The Arab world had made it political because they were trying to expand their influence. To be honest, it's something that a lot of nationalities, a lot of cultures and civilizations have done. It doesn't necessarily make it right, but that's the reality of it. So my position is that it is possible that the reason why he presented it the way he did, and like I said, I can't answer that definitively, is that it could be the influences of having been on the Cherokee reservation, which is known to have had contacts with the Islamic peoples. And again, if we accept the idea, as I think most of us here do, that there was an African Muslim presence in the Americas prior to the coming of Columbus, if we accept the idea that there were Africans, period, who were settling in the Americas and intermarrying with the different indigenous peoples here, and I think many of us here, most of us here, accept that, it stands to reason that there would have been some similarity in religious beliefs or cosmology. So that's what I would say in response to that question.
I just had one other short, just to follow up, because I think from your lecture, you somewhat suggested that in Morocco and some of the tariqas, Muslim tariqas, Tijani and Qadiani and all of these in West Africa, there was a little difference, which is true in the Islamic world. There's a little different emphasis.
Right.
But basically, their tenets are pretty much the same in terms of their beliefs and and the one God, and all of the prophets,
Right.
not just Muhammad,
Exactly.
all of them.
Exactly.
Muhammad is just the final prophet. So there wasn't that much difference, but there was, but many of the Amalekites that you mentioned had a different emphasis,
Right.
which adapted to the local culture
Right.
and the problems that they were dealing with.
Exactly. That's right.
Thank you, brother.
Okay.
Open the line.
Peace, man.
And I can say I enjoy lecture, and I feel something.
Thank you.
Good, very good man. You said something doing.
January 20th, 1790, a petition of sundry Moors was presented to the House of Representatives in the state of South Carolina. They petitioned the government to be seen by the government as Moors who were subjects of a prince in alliance with the U.S. government, and not subject to the Negro Act, which was put into effect. So what they were doing was they were trying to protect their status, their legal status in South Carolina by not allowing them to be classified as Negroes. The reason for doing that, and there's two things we learned from that. One is that obviously they phenotypically, these Moors look like other so-called Negroes, right? Because if you didn't, they wouldn't need the protection. They could have just disappeared into the mainstream society. The second thing that's significant about it is they knew something about the law, which said that they needed to proclaim themselves as Moors, because things in the United States were such that African people were increasingly being emphasized in the U.S., this new United States, as the primary slaves. And American Indians, of course, were still being enslaved, but increasingly the emphasis is turning towards African people. So people said, we have to do something to try to protect ourselves. There's governments in place. Our country signed, Morocco, our country signed a treaty with the U.S. government in 1786, which says that we as Moors are supposed to have the rights of free white citizens. And conversely, white citizens who come to the Moorish Empire are also supposed to have the rights of free subjects, free Moorish subjects. So the idea of petitioning the government was simply to protect their legal rights. Because if they didn't, and someone snatched them up, it would cause some difficulty in them arguing, no, I'm Moorish. Historically speaking, I said, in all honesty,
What happened?
oh, it passed. They were, in fact, that's why I mentioned Joseph Ben-Hali as well. It passed. A guy named Joseph Pinckney, who was one of the representatives for the state of South Carolina, agreed, and those Moors were treated as quote-unquote free whites within that region, Sumter County in South Carolina. The difficulty, to say this quickly, the difficulty was this. Needless to say, as an African person, African-American, looking African physically, walking down the street, you may have been protected by the state law and the federal law, but some European walking up on you who didn't know who you were could essentially do whatever he or she chose to get you in trouble, which happened. That's why people would have to go to court and say, no, I'm defending my right to possess arms. You had all types of court cases, for example, where people would say, I saw that Negro over there, he was carrying a weapon. And then somebody would take him to court and say, he's not a Negro. So what are we? He's not a Negro. Looks like Negro to me. He's not. The authorities would say he's not a Negro. So we're talking about the beginnings of illusion in terms of, and I shouldn't say the beginnings of illusion because the reality is they were speaking legally. You have to think like a lawyer to really appreciate the significance of this. When they went into court and said they were not Negroes, they were saying they're not Negroes. A Negro is someone who has a quasi-free or slave status. They're not a Negro. That's why Native Americans or Indians could also be designated as Negroes. But yet in other societies, other areas, other communities, they would be seen and have the rights of whites if they were a recognized national. The Cherokee, were doing very well. The Choctaw, until it was Andrew Jackson freaked out and decided to change things and forced them off their lands. But what happened? The Cherokee who agreed to assimilate into society kept their rights. The Cherokee who wanted to maintain their traditional ways were forced to do what? To leave, or worse. I guess they ended up fighting them. So that would be the significance of that petition.
I don't know. Where can I find this documentation? Is Is it Lord Journal?
Oh yeah, you can find that in Howard's report. Howard's Reports, Volume 9. You can also actually get it from the Journal of South Carolina. You can go to any library that has federal documents and look it up. January 20th, 1790, a petition of free sundry Moors.
Thank you.
You're welcome, brother.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Now you go information.
It's interesting how you cover these things and the way it relates to the group called the Unknown Waters who were here last year, and they were talking about sovereignty, and they were speaking also.
I can't hear you, brother. Could you? I'm sorry.
There's a group from New York called the Unknown Waters. They were here last year, and they were talking about the topic of sovereignty, how to become sovereign, and the fact that there were an empire of African people here in the United States before Columbus. And when that was being defeated, subsequent also 300 years later, to the defeat of the Moors in Spain. So there was a large Moroccan empire extending all the way from Africa to here, before Columbus.
Right.
And then they got to the point of signing a treaty. Not that you talk about the origin of the Indian as being related to Africa. So that's kind of shines some new light onto the topic.
Right.
So a lot of things are falling into place now, and then we're really largely deceived into the history. So I'm enjoying it by your lecture, but at the same time I'm somewhat confused. So I got to get some more information along the line to actually put it all together.
Could you give me an example? But while I'm here, tell me some aspect of what is a little bit confusing. Maybe I can help.
They mentioned the Moroccan Treaty. That's what you were talking about just now?
Right, U.S. Treaty of Morocco, right.
Yeah, that was in 1786?
86.
Okay. So that only applied to the Moors of South Carolina?
No, the treaty between the U.S. and Morocco in 1786 applied to any and all Moors living within the U.S. Any and all Moors living in the U.S. The only thing is that I just mentioned that petition in 1790 because 4 years later, that group of people in the South noticed that the situation was changing to some degree. And there was even some conflict then between the rights of the states. It's coming up again now, states' rights versus federal rights, right? So the federal government made the treaty, but the states were going, well, we'll decide whatever we want to do. So many of the people say Moors living in different areas obviously felt the need to go to the state authorities and say, look, we just want to reaffirm the fact that, we're supposed to be cool, so to speak. You're supposed to be following, and we are in alliance with the U.S. So they would have to, that was kind of like, say, a backup. And then you find later in, I mentioned the court case of Amos Daly, and also another, a man named Petrie, Mr. Petrie, who was Richard Petrie, who was actually pulled off of a British ship in port because they said that he was a colored person who should not be in the port. And this was in 1801 when that took place. And he was told that if he didn't leave by a certain time, he could be enslaved. Well, when the state of South Carolina wrote up its court case, dealing with Petrie and also dealing with a later case with Amos Daly some 20 years later, they said, we're not talking about you Moors, though. We're not talking about you Moors. If you Moors come into the port of South Carolina, you can come in freely and do whatever you have to do and then go. Because they still recognize the treaty. They still recognize the agreement. Needless to say, a lot of people didn't make the association. A lot of people didn't know the significance of calling oneself a Moor. I didn't know why it was important. And needless to say, if you are separated, the whole purpose actually of South Carolina passing this was called Colored Mariners and Ports of South Carolina. The reason why this law was passed was to prevent free Africans from coming into a state which was emphasizing the enslavement of Africans who didn't particularly know the way things were supposed to work, and acting as examples of freedom and the ability to people say, to do as well as anyone else. Needless to say, the Moors who were living in those states became increasingly compromised because, they're in a position where their existence still was quite precarious. And again, like I said, even though someone may know that the federal law, state law defends them, some European off the street may not. And anything could go. You get knocked in the head and sold down the river, which could take place and did take place. And then it would be up to you to try to get to state authorities. John Hope Franklin, from Slavery to Freedom, actually talks about how there's a greater success of African Americans in the federal and state courts in the 18th century, winning cases for freedom, than in anything else, which seems to me to indicate that there is still some recognition of this treaty and this agreement.
Do you find evidence to buttress the point that the reason that the colonial state, the empire state, was because of some kind of connection with the Moroccan Empire?
I cannot defend that. Yeah, I've heard that mentioned. You're the second person that I've heard bring it up. It's an interesting question, but I don't know. I don't know.
Next.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Everything.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
I want to thank you for coming, Professor Brother May.
Thank you, Bob.
I want to ask you a question. You're familiar with the work on Moorish Temple by Arthur Huff Sepp?
I read sections of it. In fact, I think Frank Simpson also quotes from Osset.
You don't have a copy of it?
No, I do not.
I have a copy back there for you.
Great, thank you.
And I want your rating of it, and I would
Okay.
like to know do you think there was any significance to the fact that Arthur Huff Sepp, who did this study, was a Julius Rosenwald scholar? Knowing that Julius Rosenwald Butler got murdered, Claude Green?
Right, Claude Green. Yeah, that is a good question, and now I'm out of my league.
Okay,
Because, I'm out of my league. I haven't had a chance really to look at, if I had a chance, it wasn't my focus, well, two reasons. It wasn't my focus, and I haven't had a chance to look at that aspect of Moorish science history. But I find it interesting just for you to say that. He's a Julian Rosenwald scholar.
My research took
Right, so you probably can speak on that.
We're
far
going to
greater than I.
share things down the line.
Fantastic.
How do you rate Sacred Drift?
I think Sacred Drift is probably one of the best treatments I've ever seen dealing with the Moorish Science
But
Temple.
without any citation at all. He doesn't tell you what the dates in the newspapers. I have all the copies of them. I'll make them available.
Well, he has footnotes where he offers, because I used one of his citations in my dissertation, so he does have footnotes. He doesn't give footnotes to everything.
That's the problem.
But he does give footnotes as to some of the major positions that something that I saw.
All the newspaper clippings from 1929,
Right.
I will make available to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Come on, let's go. Oh! Look, Reed's got the light. Step on that.
I said we have a question. Where would one find more information about the Maghrebli tradition, if you wanted to study that the pre-Arab Islam?
Two things. There's a book called Ancient Egyptian Science, Ancient Egyptian Sacred Science in Islam by Rafiq Bilal and Thomas Goodwin.
Right.
Then there's another book which is by a European scholar. I mentioned Lucy Bierman, who is an anthropologist who's done some work, like I said, on the Senegal Brotherhoods. And also, and I'll mention these again, what I'll do is when I finish, if you have a piece of paper, I'll just let you, I'll either let you write down these particular book titles, publishing information, and all that, because I have that here with me. The other one I was going to mention was Moroccan Islam by Dale Eichelman, who was a European Jewish scholar, European American Jewish scholar, who's at the University of Texas at Austin, who did some work on the marabouts in Moroccan Islam. So those are 3 or 4 sources I just gave you. Okay, you're welcome, brother.
You ever heard of a book called Islam and Imperialism in Senegal and Saloum by Kevin Klein?
Yes, sir. I haven't read it, but I have heard of it.
Can you come up here,
I
brother?
want to ask, could you repeat those titles on the tape?
Sure. I'll tell you what, I'll just read all the information right off of here right now. Dale Eichelman, Moroccan Islam, Tradition and Society in a Pilgrimage Center. Austin, University of Texas Press, 1976. Okay. And then the other one I mentioned was Lucy Bierman. Let me get that. Lucy Bierman, Muslim Brotherhoods and Politics in Senegal, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1970. Egyptian Sacred Science and Islam by Rafiq Bilal, Thomas Goodwin, Jersey City, New Mind Productions, 1988.